Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's episode is with University of Texas at Austin's H.W. Brands. He has a new book out, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. Today's episode is all about the debate between interventionism and isolationism in American politics and how that leads to today's debates of everything from Taiwan and Ukraine to America's broader foreign policy position moving forward. This conversation is very interesting because usually when people look at the debate behind American intervention in World War II, they portray it as a morality play. Roosevelt on the side of intervention and America Firsters like Lindbergh on the other side. This conversation, though, we get at the fact that these debates reflect broader American principles and debates we've had throughout the history of our country. As we move into the 2024 election in the coming month, we could see how policy debate and ideas actually matter when actual people get behind those ideas, and how that should shape how we think about the future moving forward, while also not misusing history and personality to support our own positions unnecessarily. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. H.W. Brands, welcome to the Realignment.
Delighted to join you.
Really excited to speak with you. I've read most of the books in this genre of the pre-war debate about American involvement in World War II. And I can't recommend your book enough, especially how much you draw from Lindbergh's letters and his writing to really give a picture of the actual person we're talking about here. But to start us off, when people hear the term America First, they are probably going to think of Donald Trump, 2016, 2020, our present day foreign policy debates. But this book, though, is about the original iteration of America First and the pre-war debate about American involvement in World War II. So contextualize what America First means in that context.
So in the mid-1930s, Americans were almost universally committed to the idea that the United States should not get involved in other countries' wars. America had gone to war in the 1910s, got involved in World War I in Europe. At the time, Americans had gone in thinking that their participation would, as President Woodrow Wilson at the time said, would make the world safe for democracy. The American side won the war, but the democracy was not made safe. In fact, events of the 1920s and 1930s made Americans believe that democracy might be under greater threat than ever. And as these events developed, Americans said, our participation the first time around was a mistake. We will not make that mistake again. Congress, responding to this general feeling, passed a series of laws, generally called the neutrality laws, that mandated that should war break out again, the United States would be neutral. Americans were disillusioned by the fact that the first time around, the president, Woodrow Wilson, had a lot of leeway to make decisions that pushed the United States closer and closer toward war, that undermined American neutrality. And the laws of the 1930s were designed essentially to handcuff the president, in this case Franklin Roosevelt, and prevent him from doing what Woodrow Wilson had done. And so this was the feeling of most Americans in the 1930s. Now, it began to shift a little bit toward 1938, 1939, as the aggressive designs of Adolf Hitler in particular became apparent. And as Hitler's treatment of Jews in Germany became evident to the world. So more people were willing to believe that Hitler was a bad guy and that he was doing bad things in Europe. There was still a lot of Americans, I'd say a majority of Americans, who didn't think that Hitler was a threat to the United States. The question was, should Americans act on a threat to somebody else, the stability of Europe, the future of democracy in Europe, potentially the condition of Jews in Europe? Or should they stick to America's own, more narrowly described interests? And so this was the setting when war broke out in Europe in early September 1939.
And another domestically relevant topic that I'd like you to talk about is the overall feeling of disillusionment, not merely with the lack of security for democracy in the 1930s, but talk of the defense industry scamming during the war, the overall feeling of corruption, because that's an underlying feeling that fuels the disillusionment beyond just we don't want to go across the ocean again.
That's right. So very much of the attitude of Americans reflected the idea that the United States had been sold a bill of goods by Americans, weapons manufacturers, chemical manufacturers, the bankers who had loaned money to the European governments that might go under if their side lost the war, that America had been misled into war by their elected officials and by industrial and financial leaders. And that this was exactly what they needed to guard against in the future. So, and I should add that all of this stuff takes place against a backdrop in the United States, indeed in much of the world, of the Great Depression. And so many Americans said, we don't need to go over to other countries. We don't need to cross the ocean to solve people's problems. We've got enough problems in America. So that was a big part of this story as well.
Before we get to Lindbergh, I would like to really focus in on the way that both America Firsters, but also interventionists described the United States at this time from a geographic perspective. The phrase hemispheric is just consistently issued time and time again. Could you speak to that conception and what it meant at the time from a security and even just national conception perspective?
Yeah. So there was this thinking that the Americas, taken plural, North and South America and Central America, they formed a geographic unit that made sense in the degree that it was isolated on the east and west by wide oceans. And so going back to the early 19th century when James Monroe had articulated the Monroe Doctrine, there was this feeling in the United States that the Americas were a zone separate from the rest of the world. And it was legitimate for the United States to think hemispherically. So the Monroe Doctrine basically said that the Americas are off limits to European expansion. And as it was articulated and ramified over the next several decades, American leaders said, okay, well, we will take responsibility for the security of the Americas. It's worth pointing out that the governments of other countries in the Americas, the other American republics, were not consulted in this. This was a unilateral American position. And I should add here that the America Firsters were often described as isolationists, and that's an exaggeration of their position. They didn't call themselves isolationists. They were hemisphyricists, and they believed in a robust defense of the Western Hemisphere. And Charles Lindbergh, their chief spokesman, he said that the United States ought to use new aerial technology, the new airplanes that were used in war, to build air bases all along the coasts of North and South America, so that if any enemy, presumably Germany, approached, the United States could hit their warships hundreds of miles off the coast. So Lindbergh actually thought of American security much more broadly than earlier generations did. But he specifically wanted to exclude Europe and exclude Asia. Now, in fact, in the debate of all of this, although there's a war going on in Asia, Japan has attacked and invaded China, and the war's been going on there for years. Very little of the debate in the United States focuses on that aspect of the war. That's a different war. But it's the war in Europe that really engages the American debate. And Lindbergh again takes the position that the troubles of Europe are Europe's troubles. They needn't become America's troubles unless we make them our troubles, and we shouldn't do that.
So let's talk about Lindbergh. So anyone who doesn't know who FDR is or FDR's position after his second reelection, where he's flummoxed and stymied by the core packing attempt and the New Deal running out of political and policy energy, has not been paying attention up until this point. So we'll skip FDR. Talk about Lindbergh, both frankly, just from birth, because his political background with his family is very relevant to this story and his views. Introduce Lindbergh to folks.
So Lindbergh's father was a congressman and had been a member of Congress during World War I. And he had been opposed to American intervention in World War I. And his opposition earned him harsh treatment from the Wilson administration. He was dealt with under the Sedition Act, and he was basically drummed out of politics. And Charles Lindbergh, the son, was a young man, a teenager at the time, and he observed this, and he developed a strong distaste for politics, because he believed that politicians did not have the interests of the country at heart. They had their own narrow interests, but they used the rhetoric of national interest to make steps that would benefit themselves individually. And he determined he would not go into politics. He claimed to loathe politics. He distrusted all politicians. But he did have this background, and he did have this memory of his father, and his father had been badly used by the interventionists of the day. Okay, so he goes in a different direction. He becomes this famous aviator. He is the first person to fly across the Atlantic nonstop. And as a result of this, he becomes a world-renowned hero. He was to the 1920s what American astronauts were to the 1960s. So, your John Glenn or Neil Armstrong, well, Charles Lindbergh was that way. But actually, he was even more that because he's one of a kind. And particularly at a moment when media in the United States were evolving. And for the first time, the news could be conveyed in images, visual images to viewers. Not television yet, but television-like. These were the newsreels. These are short films that were taken of the real events, and then they were edited quickly and shown to audiences when they typically would go to the movies on Saturday. And they'd see a 10-minute newsreel of the latest. And Charles Lindbergh was perfect for this because he was a young guy, handsome. He was soft-spoken. He didn't make too much of himself. And the thing that he did made him world famous. Now, the closest thing in America was Babe Ruth, who in the same year hit 60 home runs. But baseball was an American thing only. Charles Lindbergh's thing, this was a world event. He was more a hero in France where he landed than he was in the United States where he took off. And largely because of this, and he was not simply a pilot. He was a designer of planes. He was an engineer. He wound up knowing more about the aircraft, the war aircraft of the world probably than anybody else because he liked to travel. He would fly around and he would fly from one country to another. And every country where he landed, the government there would usually give him its highest medal for great achievement. He won the Legion of Honor of the French government. And actually, to his later dismay, he was decorated by the German government. This was used against him. But he was also invited to review the air forces of the various countries and visit their aircraft manufacturing plants because they wanted to pick his brain and find out sort of what he knew, how could their planes be improved. And meanwhile, maybe he'd tell them something about what the other ones were doing. So by the way, and during all this time, Lindbergh maintained a reserve commission in the U.S. Army Air Corps. So we'd come back to Washington and he'd say, okay, I visited the German plants and these are the kind of planes that they have. I've been to France, here are their airplanes. I've been to Japan, these are their planes. And so in this age of this coming age of air travel and air warfare, he was the go-to guy. Now, there was one other aspect that really thrust him even farther into the limelight than anyone expected and than he wanted. And that was in the middle of his celebrity, his infant son was kidnapped and murdered. And the kidnap was called the crime of the century, and the trial became the trial of the century. And Lindbergh felt very badly used by the press, the media, and particularly the newsreel people, because in their desperate hunt to get the most emotional, the most compelling video film, they'd stick cameras in his face. They'd stick cameras in his wife's face. They would harass his other children. In one case, some people with cameras broke into the morgue in New Jersey where the body of his infant son lay, and they took pictures that then were published of the dead child. And he thought this was terrible. This was horribly intrusive. So it utterly alienated Lindbergh from this aspect of public life. He was a celebrity. He was a public figure, but he was never comfortable in public. In fact, before long, after the trial, he fled America and took his small family, and they lived in England for a while because the English were more polite in this regard than the Americans were at this stage.
Something I'm curious about as a biographer and a historian, what is your opinion of Lindbergh as a man? Because something you do so helpfully in the book is you feature his journals and his letters. So, private thoughts. And to be honest, more than I have this reaction to him whenever I read books about this period. I found him to just be a distasteful individual. This isn't just like a reference to his racism and his chauvinism. It's more just that he's arrogant. His writing is so arrogant. He's saying this person is interesting, this person isn't interesting, without, having, I think, the requisite like knowledge and experience or sort of experience in like politics to make those assessments. I would just be curious. So that was just my like harsh reaction to seeing his inner thoughts. What was your reaction to him as a biographer?
Lindbergh traveled a lot, but the travel didn't open him out. In some ways, it narrowed him down because he took his preconceptions with him and he measured other people against this ideal that he had. And it was ideal that was it wasn't even ideal that existed in America at the time. It was this ideal. It was a century out of date. He spoke often of hating cities, of hating urban life, of hating modern life. This is pretty ironic, coming from the guy who was at the cutting edge of modern technology, spent all his time in cities, and was famous for this. He really wrestled with his fame. He realized it gave him a soapbox eventually, which became important to him. But he wanted to have the good stuff and didn't want the bad stuff of it. He really was a throwback in terms of his ideas of what the world should be. He spoke often of wishing he had lived 100 years earlier in America, when America was less tainted by modernism. He really disliked modernism. And the modernism included all sorts of stuff. Some of it included, what in his era was called the new immigration. He was okay with immigrants from Scandinavia and immigrants from Germany, sort of the old immigrants from the British Isles. But the new immigrants from the Mediterranean, from Russia, Jewish immigrants, they seemed to be of a different sort. He did have a very sort of racialist or sort of racist view of what other people have called sort of the clash of civilizations. And he said, the white race needs to defend itself against the other races. And the idea, one of the things that upset him about the direction that things were going in Europe was the Europeans were fighting against each other. And they shouldn't be doing that because they needed to band together against the threatening other folks. He had a grave dislike and phobia of communists. And this allowed him, and of course, people like Lindbergh, who have that kind of racialized view of the world, they don't know what to do with the Russians, because the Russians are partly European and partly Asian. And at least the country spans both of those. And Lindbergh lumped Russia in with the Asians. And so he thought that, he really got upset sort of quietly, with Germany for tolerating Hitler, because Hitler was making it impossible for the British and the French and the Germans and the Americans to ally against the real enemy, the Russians. And so you get a lot of this. And he's, as you mentioned, his reading his diary, it does come across as arrogant. Now, you gotta allow a little bit for diaries. Diaries are sort of narcissistic anyway. But Lindbergh didn't suffer fools at all, and he thought a lot of people were fools.
I think the thing that I wonder, and this is where you see both his strengths and his weaknesses. As you said, he's an engineer. When he is talking about aircraft production, when he's talking about the nature, his testimony, when he's talking about the fact that aircraft carriers don't present a threat, and it's very, very learned, very, very helpful, rings very true. It's sort of free from ideology. Yet at the same time, as you've said, he's an incredibly ideological person. So, for example, as you point out, describing his ideology as purely isolationist doesn't quite get at it, because, he says, I could see intervention being necessary if it was to defend the white race. This goes to your point about Russia and the Orient. So he's this weird mix of the precision and the empiricism of the engineer, but also just a deeply, deeply ideological person in a way that would not necessarily involve everyone else in the broad America First coalition. So, and it should be noted, you don't write about this in the book, but his wife, Anne, also wrote a very important book, sort of arguing these right-wing, even fascist thoughts on the state of the West, on the state of the country. Where does this ideology, which could be separated from the idea that America doesn't need to intervene in Europe militarily, where does that ideology come from?
I think it's some of Lindbergh's reaction against modernity. He's a man born a century too late. Now, this is a common way for people to think, but they imagine that things have been better 100 years before, and that life had been better before technology and cities ruined everything. One of the things that kept occurring to me about Lindbergh in reading this is, as you point out, he knew a whole lot about one area. But for the rest of the world, he wasn't particularly well-read, he wasn't particularly educated, and he wasn't especially interested. And for this reason, it was a strange thing that he became the spokesman for this very important position. There were other people who were better qualified to take this position, but because he was a celebrity, and for this reason, he could essentially get free airtime. And if he said, I want to give a talk, the radio networks would be happy to let him talk. One could imagine, if George Clooney wants to talk on politics today, he'll get covered. And, so Lindbergh was that way. He was woefully out of his depth in politics. And the politicians that he spoke to often had to try to explain things, the way the political world works. And on one occasion, he says something, maybe we'll get to this, where the media blows up when he gives his speech in Des Moines, Iowa, which is widely perceived as anti-Semitic. And he goes to Herbert Hoover, the former president, and he says, well, what did I say that was wrong? And he said, well, it's not that you said anything wrong. It was simply wrong that you said it, because there are things you can't say in politics. If you do, they will rebound against you in a way that you don't want. And honesty is no defense. So at times Lindbergh could be insightful, as you mentioned, when he's talking about the technology of it, and what the aircraft can do and what they can't do. But in other times, he's as obtuse as can be.
I think what's interesting about Lindbergh then as well is that he, in many ways, should be juxtaposed to someone like Joseph P. Kennedy. So Joseph P. Kennedy is the father of JFK and RFK. He is ambassador to the Court of St. James's, and he notably struggles in that position because he's so limited by his experience as a businessman. He also, in many ways, from my reading, rejects the conception of like what politics is. And in many ways, he says, I'm a businessman. He conceives of international affairs in this very businessman-like way. I'd love to hear that. And the point of the Joseph P. Kennedy story that I've covered, like with Fred Vogelbaugh on his JFK bio, is he fails to understand Hitler because he just cannot reject that businessman's background of him. He thinks of relations between England and the US and Germany in terms of trade, and he just can't focus on the nationalism or the nature of what Hitler represented himself. What do you think Lindbergh did not understand about Hitler, Japan, Italy, that manifested from these ideologies and backgrounds he had?
I would say, I'm not sure that he didn't understand Hitler and Japan. What he didn't understand was the state of the American mind. He didn't understand that Americans could be appealed to by somebody like Roosevelt and made to believe that they really could save the world. Now, he had been looking at American public opinion during the previous decades, and Americans said, we don't want to save the world. We don't want to save the world. But Franklin Roosevelt was very effective in persuading Americans that Hitler represented an existential threat to the United States. Now, I think it's still even to this day, I think it's quite arguable whether that was true or not. But Roosevelt made Americans believe it. And he made Americans believe that it was in their interests and it was in their tradition that they needed to defend democracy. He sort of ignored the whole business about having tried to the first time around and it didn't work. But when he portrayed to Americans this broad vision of what their country could do, how their country could become a leader of the world, how their country could be really great. Well, this appealed to Americans in a way that Lindbergh simply didn't understand and didn't foresee. Because Lindbergh's thinking was really set back in the 19th century when Americans did not dream that their country could be, or should be a leader of the world. It was enough to defend American interests at home. But when Roosevelt put it in the context of there are suffering people in Europe, there are people who think like us, look like us, talk like us, they need our help, we can help them. He was tapping into a streak in the American public mind that Lindbergh, I don't know, it just didn't resonate with him at all. And it surprised him, it frustrated him that Roosevelt was able to bring American public opinion along the way it did. Because the way Lindbergh saw it, Roosevelt was saying that he was trying to keep America out of the war, while actually he was trying to get America into the war. And Lindbergh was saying, look, I told you back in 1939, when the debate really opens with the invasion of Germany, the invasion of Poland by Germany, that, if we repeal the arms embargo, then we're not going to be neutral anymore, and we're going to tilt toward Britain. And that's going to get us closer to the war. Roosevelt was saying, yeah, we're going to help the British, but that's going to keep us out of the war. Because if we can send weapons to the British, then we won't have to send troops. But Lindbergh say, no, the troops are coming. The troops are coming. And when the troops finally came, he could say, well, I told you so. But by then, of course, America had been attacked, and the debate ends at that point. When the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, then there's no ground for the anti-interventionists to stand on anymore.
I think it's easy to do a conversation like this and read a book like yours and just conclude that the purpose of the exercise is to say that Lindbergh is just completely wrong and misled. But I think it is really relevant when you read his writings about what a war in Europe would mean from an American intervention perspective. He calls the next 60 to 70 years. So, and I think the obviously FDR is duplicitous in the way he would sort of, you cover him sparring with the press. He's using very, very specific, he's sort of like doing a preview of Bill Clinton in the 1990s during the Lewinsky scandal, in the sense that he's saying, well, I used this word and not that word. They're like, but these words mean something. He's sort of like, oh, well, it's very lawyerly in the way he approaches it. But at the same time, Lindbergh, in his lack of, I think, let's say, the way you put it, his inability to sort of disguise his viewpoints or narrow his arguments, he says, look, American intervention is going to lead to us having to stay in Europe. We are going to remain engaged in Europe. We barely made it out of World War I, rejecting the League of Nations, declining to intervene further during the 20s and 1930s. If we do this being World War II, the John Quincy Adams vision, the Washington vision is gone. And I think he's correct about that. So can you talk about this side of the discussion?
Yeah. So another thing that Lindbergh really disliked and warned against was the precedent that Roosevelt was setting. Because every time a dent was made in the neutrality legislation, it always gave authority to the president to determine, for example, when a war was underway. And it gave the Lend-Lease Act, for example, of early 1941, authorized the president to determine which countries should get American aid. And Lindbergh looked at that and he said, this is a license for a president to put us in a position where war is the only way out. And Lindbergh said, Congress is supposed to be the one to determine whether we go to war or not. That's what the Constitution says. But if we follow Roosevelt down this path, Congress will be sidelined. And of course, it's worth noting that Congress has not declared war officially since the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Everybody accepts now that presidents really take the lead in all of this. And a president can put the United States in a position where Congress essentially just has to approve the money to allow the initiative, the expedition to go forward. Because as Roosevelt demonstrated, you take a step, and before you know it, we've been attacked. And once we've been attacked, then Congress has to follow along. So Lindbergh saw that there was this abdication by Congress in its authority to, on behalf of the people of the United States, to really debate, is this in the American national interest or not? And he thought that would continue. And I think we see that to this day, to the point now where if you change a president, you can easily change American foreign policy, because so much is in the hands of a president. You can change trade policy. You can trade, policy on sanctions, on just about anything, because so much has been put in the president's hands. And Lindbergh said that's not what the framers of the Constitution intended. That's not what George Washington intended. That's not what the first 150 years of American history intended. And so this is what you're going to get if we elect Roosevelt and we allow him to get away with this.
And now a quick word about the A16Z podcast. Hey, it's Marshall. In an exponential era, it's more important than ever for our country to have alignment between policymakers, founders, and funders. However, it's rare that we find them all in the same room. That's where the A16Z podcast from Andreessen Horowitz comes in. They bring together guests like the very first CTO of the CIA and the chief security officers behind OpenAI, Anthropic, and DeepMind to cover topics like intelligence in the era of AI, the nuclear renaissance, the future of defense, and much more in the world of American dynamism, the term coined by A16Z general partner and friend of the Realignment, Catherine Boyle. The A16Z podcast's episodes also tackle other important trends in technology and business, from supply chains to space and beyond. Want to know more about the $3 billion record Social Security breach? They've got you covered. Wondering if tech can finally disrupt the healthcare industry? They recently broke this down. Curious about governing democracy, corporate boards, and the internet? Listen in to find out. Eavesdrop on the future with the A16Z podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now. thing that I found lacking from Lindbergh's perspective when he's writing about the case for a hemispheric approach to U.S. foreign policy, he's not interested at all in economics and trade. So when he's talking about here is why the United States will be safe from Nazi intervention, let's say they conquer England. Well, ultimately, there are so many limits of what actual bombers based, let's say, in Greenland or aircraft carriers, not that the Germans had any at the time, but there's a real limit in what they could do. He's very precise. He's like, they could launch raids, but you don't conquer a country via raids. That's very accurate. As he pointed out, they had launched a full-scale battle of Britain, and they couldn't even win that when all they had separating them from the British was the English Channel. But at the same time, this has been widely written about. So much of American prosperity and industrial strength was underwritten by the British Navy, by the fact that there were free seas, by the fact that no one could interdict American trade. I just found his lack of focus on the idea, on just purely thinking of America's internal security through the lens purely of munitions and aircraft is incredibly limited. I'd be curious, what you thought about that side of things as you're reading and writing about him and his approach.
Lindbergh had the disdain for capitalism that a lot of people at various times in American history have had. And it's as though he never asked himself, so where did all this prosperity come from? If it had been put to him, well, okay, America needs to continue to trade with these countries. He probably would have said, yeah, but all that requires is continued neutrality. And okay, if the German submarines are interdicting our trade, well, we'll do something about that then. But we don't need to send troops to Europe. America's frontier might exist at the boundary of the Western Hemisphere, but it certainly should not be on the Rhine River. And so that's where he would draw the line. But you're right. I mean, he was quite uninterested in the operation of economics and in what trade contributed to that. I should add, though, that in Roosevelt's arguments for this, Roosevelt wasn't making the case that American capitalism needs these markets either. And so Roosevelt sort of assumed that, and in Roosevelt's case, not that the capitalists would be grateful at all because they all despise Roosevelt anyway.
I think the fascinating thing here, and once again, this is reading directly from his writing on the period, you've written about the 1950s and the Cold War. I was just struck by, even though his writings, let's say in 1937 and 1938 about the limits of air power, how even in the next 6 years, so much research and development in science pretty much, I don't want to say knocks out the things he's talking about, but makes them less relevant. So for example, the Germans start using V1 and V2 rockets during the World War. So even with the limited technology at the time, the question stops being clearly, okay, we're only thinking about the capacity for bombers to make it across the channel or the limits of an aircraft carrier. Because by even the late 1950s, the bomber fleets we have become less relevant when it comes to the nuclear triad because everything's delivered via ICBMs. So another frustrating point I was thinking was you are so accurate in your description of this present moment, but I think his inability to imagine a future where technology looks different, where the playing field and the rules itself change, that was just what's so frustrating in my experience. So I would just be curious, as a person who writes on the Cold War and the Korean War and the threat of escalation, I didn't even mention the atomic bomb, right? Which even one bomber getting through is more than just a raid. Talk about how science and development just made this so much more difficult over the course of the next 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So Lindbergh could see several years in the future, but he couldn't see the stuff you're talking about. And so nobody foresaw the atom bomb in 1937. So
we'll give him that.
Yeah, we'll give him that. But beyond that, I mean, he did have this idea that the Western Hemisphere was defensible. And it certainly was defensible in the terms that he described. For the atom bomb to work, the United States had to have a base 2/3 of the way across the Pacific to be within reach of Japan. It would have been quite a stretch to fly a bomber. I mean, certainly in the time frame we're talking about, fly a bomber from Germany to the United States. And so there's that part of it. But one of the things that Lindbergh did point out that does certainly emerge in the Cold War is that he said, if you're interested in defending democracy, we're not doing it the right way. because you're asking us to defend Britain, which is not a democracy, certainly not in its empire. Ask the Indians, people living in India. They think it's democracy? No. And especially after Germany attacked the Soviet Union. And Roosevelt turned around and immediately started sending Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. Lindbergh says, what are we doing? We're making the world safe for communism, not for democracy. And he didn't exactly predict the outcome of the war as it led into the Cold War, but he wouldn't have been surprised because, again, if you can sort of separate out the racial views of the white race against the yellow races, he would have said that it's democracy against communism. If it's democracy against anybody, fascism, that's not quite the threat that communism is. And if you look at the 40 years of the Cold War, well, in that part, he's not particularly wrong. He wouldn't have been surprised that the war ended with the United States squaring off against communist Soviet Union. Under other circumstances, he did say that the United States might have to learn to live with these autocrats. Now, at the time, he was thinking of Hitler. And of course, he was denounced for this. No, we're not going to live with autocrats. But of course, that's exactly what the United States did during the Cold War. We learned to live with the communist autocrats for 40 years.
And I think the thing that's difficult about this is especially who knows what the world would have looked like if Stalin had lived longer. But I think the fundamental error there is just that at the end of the day, Nikita Khrushchev and beyond Soviet Union are tolerable as adversaries. They're tolerable as rulers of half of the world in a way that Hitler wouldn't be. So talk about Hitler for a second, because I think that so much of this story, as you're reading it from the present day, when I said earlier, he got it wrong. So much of and Joseph P. Kennedy does this, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. does this. So many parts of the America First Coalition did this. They took such a sympathetic eye towards Hitler and the case that Hitler was making against the other Western powers, focusing on the Treaty of Versailles, focusing on the ways that the post-war settlement wasn't reasonable for Germany. And he does this explicitly and makes a humongous political error because it was unforced when he says that he just thought of, it's not, so FDR, being a wily politician, says, I'm not asking us to intervene for Great Britain, but of course I'm asking us to be sympathetic towards Great Britain. Of course I'm asking us to be sympathetic towards a democracy. And Lindbergh won't even do that. He just says, look, these are all European powers who are fighting over land that we all left behind when our migrant ancestors came here. So just talk about the role that Hitler, as just the 20th century sort of big bad, this great villain, how he and his intentions just sort of wrangles the difficult case for the America Firsters.
Yeah. So the first thing I'll do is respond to Lindbergh's response to not expressing sympathy for Britain and France, because Lindbergh, again, operating from the perspective of World War I, saw that when World War I broke out in 1914, Woodrow Wilson proclaimed neutrality on the part of the United States and asked the American people to be neutral in thought as well as in deed. And then he watched as Wilson didn't do that, became more and more sympathetic to the British and the French, to the point where intervention on behalf of the British and French became essentially inevitable. And Lindbergh saw the same thing happening because he said, if we're sympathetic toward the British and the French, if they start to lose, then we have to act on those sympathies and we have to escalate our support. Furthermore, he hoped that the United States maybe could stay out and be an honest broker between the two sides, that there would be a negotiated settlement. And if the United States had already morally signed on with one side, then it wouldn't be in a position to do that. What Lindbergh was looking for really until Pearl Harbor was a negotiated settlement between the Germans on the one hand, we'll include the Italians, and the British. The French are kind of out of it, but France would be revived in some way. And that there would be this balance of power in Europe. The problem, he felt, was that if the United States went in, it would just eliminate any chance of a European balance of power because the United States would be held accountable for European security in the future. Now, as far as Hitler, what to make of him? Well, the first thing is, nobody knew quite what to make of him. People after the fact said, yeah, well, we read Mein Kampf and we knew what it was coming to. But most of the world was shocked, appalled at discovering the death camps. There had been rumors about all this, but the extent of this. And so this was something that it's impossible to know what Lindbergh would have said had he known this back then, but of course nobody did. When he was making his argument, it was a time when the Nuremberg laws sort of were the state of German oppression of Jews. And the Nuremberg laws were not that much more extreme than the Jim Crow laws in the United States. They singled out a particular group of people, and they were saddled with legal and political disabilities. And, this was the law of the land in the United States. So at that point, he could think, well, yes, Hitler is mistreating the Jews, but lots of people get mistreated around the world. If he had known, if the world had known what Hitler was capable of, really, then all this debate would have been very different. But it's impossible to say exactly when and how it would have differed.
Because the key thing about the debate being different is the Hitler that we learn of when we see Auschwitz and Treblinka is not merely one of many European power leaders who's attempting to adjudicate his territorial demands. He's clearly something bigger and something more. And the question of, and this is why the great debate is so interesting, because it's not oddly specific. It's helpfully specific, in contrast to so many debates that we've had over the course of our history, in that the debate is, to what degree is America safe if the rest of the world is at war? Now, if we know about what Hitler is to the furthest extent, I think it's much less comfortable for someone to say, look, if he controls Europe, if he basically divides up parts of the British Empire, that's something we ultimately could live with. That question is going to change after 1945, so that's very helpful.
I could just add one thing on this, if I could.
Yeah, please.
And that is that Stalin in Ukraine in the 1930s had been responsible for atrocities that approached the Holocaust, perhaps not in absolute numbers, but millions died as a result of a deliberate campaign of starvation. And the world just kind of looked past that. And once Stalin became an ally of the United States, that was largely forgotten. One of the outcomes of the war was, the United States sent Lend-Lease aid to China and helped secure the future of Mao Zedong and the communists, who, in a great leap forward, killed millions too. And the United States lived with that. So the idea that Hitler was such a bad guy that he could not be lived with, I think, is at least questioned by the fact that the United States did learn to live with other really bad people.
I think the difference then would be, and this is the difference between Mao, Stalin of the early 30s, and Hitler, is that at least, and this is putting aside the Baltic countries for a second, and Eastern Poland, they at least, and especially post-Cold War, were fine staying within their borders. So there was not an imagined situation where Mao's China would invade Japan or would force the U.S. out of Okinawa in a way that would have been open when it came to Hitler. It really, to me, seems so. I think you've done a really great way of illustrating the point that the 20th century has countless villains beyond Hitler. Sometimes there are ways to argue that the Great Leap Forward and its consequences far exceeded the Holocaust. But the difference really just comes down to the desire to expand one's border and dominate huge parts. So I think that's where the interesting sort of where Hitler jumps off that path and becomes unique. Pol Pot, monstrous. Right. Contained to Cambodia. And I think that's a critical difference. So let's talk about Asia for a second then. It's so interesting that Asia doesn't show up in his conception. And Asia enters the story late in the game because at the end of the day, Roosevelt was focused on Europe, and Roosevelt was certainly not focused on Hawaii. You write that the expectation was if any war was going to happen, it'd start in the Philippines, because the Philippines are right next to Japan's encroachments into Southeast Asia and China. Where does Asia fall into, besides just sort of his racism towards Asian people? Where does that fall into the framework of America First and the hemispheric defense?
It hardly figures at all, because the people who were drawn to the America First campaign, the committee, they tended to be Atlanticist in their direction. They were immigrants from Europe. At the time, in the Midwest, around Chicago, which was the home ground of America First, there were very few immigrants from China or people whose grandparents had come from China or from Japan. So it was a very different thing. American attitudes toward China had been oddly paternal for decades. And some of it reflected the fact that the only people in America who knew much about China were missionaries who'd gone out there and their children. And so they had this particular view of what China might become. But they kind of had the argument, they had the venue to themselves because nobody really knew much about it. Japan was a bit of a cipher for a long time. Japan had come close to blows with the United States over the Philippines, but that had been worked out. And then there was a question of, well, we can allow Japanese maybe to enter the United States even against the Chinese Exclusion Act and all of that. So the United States had treated Japan differently, but there was no broad scale interest in the affairs of Asia the way there was in Europe, because there were very few personal connections on the part of the American people to Asia, the way that there were in Europe. And so, and it's worth also remembering that until Pearl Harbor, they were two separate wars. World War World War II had not begun in Asia. And indeed, what was happening in Europe was not World War II either. There was a European war, there was an Asian war. There seemed to be very little that connected them. There was this sort of affinity between the fascists of Europe and the Japanese. It was formalized in the Axis Pact. But there was no commitment to fight on behalf of each other, especially if there was aggression on the part of, when Japan attacked the United States. Hitler, even if he had honored his part of the pact, wasn't required to go to the assistance of Japan. And so those two wars were quite separate. And in some ways, one was the distraction from the other. And this worked in Roosevelt's benefit to some degree, because all the debate was over whether the United States is doing too much or too little for Europe. Meanwhile, he launched an economic war through sanctions and embargoes against Japan, and was putting the screws on Japan in a way that culminated in Japan's blow against the United States at Pearl Harbor. And that took all sorts of people by surprise. That always took second billing in the news accounts. And of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the attack on Hawaii took Roosevelt by surprise. He wasn't surprised that the Japanese did strike out, but he was expecting it to come elsewhere.
And it should be noted that I referenced the Philippines, but as you note in the book, the Philippines were slated to be independent. You know, America made the attempt at building a colonial empire in the wake of the Spanish-American War, but within a decade, that effort peters out. The imperial sort of mantle doesn't quite take hold to the American identity in a way that is pretty predictable and understandable. So it's relevant that the Philippines were not top of everyone's mind. It should be noted too, and you illustrate this as well. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria started before Hitler even came to power. So these really are separate. These literally are separate wars. And it should be helpfully understood as I'm discussing, well, what did he think about Asians? What do people think about Asians? I don't think the starting point of Southeast Asia was what do the Asian thinks. It's part of the French Empire. It's part of the British Empire. It's part of the Dutch Empire. This goes to your point earlier too, where it's easy to say this is the war for democracy, this is the war for freedom. But from an American historical perspective, if there's one thing we didn't intervene in, it was European colonial imperial fights. Like, what's the Boer War to us? What are the Napoleonic, well, beyond, the Louisiana Purchase, what are the Napoleonic Wars to us? They really are this separate sphere that doesn't fit into a straightforward democracy framework. So for this last section, you very helpfully don't do the thing which is, I think, made too many history books hard to read now, which is sort of overly intersperse the present with the past. There's a little epilogue that hints at things, but it's so hard to read books where in every chapter there's the and this, by the way, is that, because it's more complicated than that. But I would like to talk about the conclusions that you came to writing and researching this book, because I'm not someone, I'm interventionist in my politics. I support Ukraine, I support Taiwan, but I'm not someone who just recoils at the phrase America first, because my takeaway from the book could be, there was an entire interventionist case that I think in a weird way is American, that it's based on American interest, that isn't we fight for king and country, that isn't Anglophilic, that isn't Francophilic. Because once again, my, Monday morning quarterback almost a century later take was Hitler would have expanded to threaten the Western Hemisphere, and technological developments such as the missile, such as the nuclear weapon would have been too constrained on the United States, would have threatened democracy at home. But none of that requires making this sort of, and we're going to launch the UN, and there are going to be the four freedoms. So that was just my sort of reaction, that the America First phrasing isn't just sort of not necessarily offensive, but it's also weirdly unhelpful when it comes to policy debates. Like, there's an America First case for supporting Ukraine, if you articulate it in a certain way. So that was kind of my takeaway. I'd be curious what your takeaways would be.
So one of the principal takeaway that I have from this is that because the anti-interventionist argument in 1939 to 1941 was discredited by subsequent events, when it became clear that people like Lindbergh were saying we should not go to war against Hitler. The United States did go to war against Hitler, and by the end of the war, by 1945, Americans universally believed, yes, this was the right thing to do, and if anything, we should have gone to war sooner. So the anti-interventionist case was discredited by events. And being discredited,
and to be precise, we didn't cover this, but by Lindbergh's overt anti-Semitism. So the way he performed the case is crucial to how it fell apart for him. I just want to note that.
It did. It did for him personally, and it tended to really take the last of the wind out of the sails of the anti-interventionist side. Interestingly, though, in some ways, as the war ended, and with the world saw how the war ended, it both enhanced, it seemed to intensify Lindbergh's culpability, but in some ways it mitigated it because, okay, he was anti-Semitic in a fairly pedestrian way in 1941 when he gives his speech in Des Moines, where he says the Jews are this powerful lobby that is pushing the United States toward war. By the way, he does say in that speech, he doesn't find that unnatural. He sees nothing wrong with it except that it shouldn't guide American policy. So he said, the Jews have every reason to make this case. It's just that I don't think that should then be the decisive matter for American policy. But so he's labeled as an anti-Semite, and the label, he's given enough to his opponents to make the charges stick. Okay. So it seems plausible that he is an anti-Semite. But they certainly play it for all it is politically worth because they recognize that you can undermine an argument by attacking the arguer. If you can discredit the person making the argument, then in most people's thinking, the argument becomes less persuasive. And so what happens then is when the full depth of Hitler's evil becomes apparent, his treatment of the Jews, especially with the discovery of the Holocaust, then that Hitler, the anti-Semitism charged to Lindbergh seems to be bigger, except that in some ways it's less because he was just he trafficked in stereotypes primarily, whereas he didn't send people to death camps and he didn't say that anybody ought to go to death camps. But it's relatively easy to draw a line from, well, this is where it starts and this is where it ends up. But what happens is it discredits the case that is, after the war, it's never called the anti-interventionist case. It's called the isolationist case. And isolation is a term that's always pejorative. And the way it is interpreted is, there were these bad guys, including Hitler, who was a bad guy because he was a racist and anti-Semite, and they were the isolationists. So anybody from 1941 till almost today who says, maybe we shouldn't get involved there. Maybe we ought to think twice about giving more aid to Ukraine. If you can label them an isolationist, then you can discredit the argument. You essentially have to say no more. And it's almost, I exaggerate here when I say that because Charles Lindbergh was an anti-Semite, then the United States needs to defend Taiwan against China. I mean, the argument is almost like that because the only people who argue otherwise are these bad guys, and they're basically in cahoots with somebody like Lindbergh.
Yeah, and it should be noted there are plenty of anti-Semites who are on the interventionist side of this debate as well. There's a way there, and this is what you meant when you said his anti-Semitism is very pedestrian. This is not a stunningly hot take to hold if you're an elite on the East Coast who tends to run the Anglo-descended power structure of the political system. And I just want to say, as we wrap here, I think the key thing here too is, I read these histories very much the way that you're articulating here, which is there's a need, I think at a biographical level, so much of what Lindbergh does is wrong from a arrogance perspective. He needs to be more worldly. He's too confident in his views. He's too I've noted this in previous books I've read, but the people he finds interesting tend to be people who agree with him. I've noticed not that many people that he writes, and you catalog this journal. I met Joseph P. Kennedy, the ambassador, and found him to be informed and interesting. Basically, no one holds that opinion except for Charles Lindbergh. So there's just a lesson about humility there. So I think focusing on his personal behavior, and I think focusing on his personal views in a democracy matters, because as he I think, eloquently states, I'm but one of 130 million people who have views in a democracy, and I should be able to express them. There's a whole other episode we can do about how his fears of his opinion being cracked down in an anti-democratic way are completely valid from the perspective of what happens during World War I. It's not merely that the interventionists win the war. It's just people should read Adam Hochschild's American Midnight on this. The domestic repression of German Americans, the domestic repression of anyone who's skeptical of socialism. Eugene V. Debs goes to jail for years. These are very valid concerns. But that said, one should practice democracy with a degree of humility and awareness as to these dynamics. So that's the personal lesson. But the broader political lesson is the ideas that he articulates, once you move beyond the personal distaste of the way he expresses them, are relevant ideas. The idea that we should debate the degree to which America should be connected to Europe was relevant then, it's relevant today. And I tend to just, frankly, despite not being, I work at the Hudson Institute, so I'm very much in the interventionist camp of American politics. I just avoid the term isolationist because, to your point, we so read it through the lens of World War II, but it just shuts down debate and thought processes. So I think that's very key, and I appreciate you having that takeaway. Yeah,
and I would amplify that. I would say there are arguments for why the United States should defend Taiwan, but they don't depend on the arguments that were made in 1940. There are arguments that should apply to today, because 1940 is not 2024 and Xi Jinping is not Adolf Hitler.
No, and this is it's hard to read post-Korean Cold War history and not conclude that the Munich appeasement story misleads more than it guides. I'm totally in favor of, defending Berlin, but once you extend beyond that, you have Vietnam, you have other various Cold War overflows, you have the variety of ways it was utilized during the Iraq War. The way I like to think about and frame World War II for people is that at an academic level, World War II raises very interesting questions, which can also be applied to modern conflict. So I'm not going to say Vladimir Putin is Adolf Hitler and anyone who opposes him is the moral equivalent of the appeasers. What I would say is, look, World War II raises the question of, if you give a dictator what they want, will they stop then? To what degree can you truly be neutral, et cetera? So those are relevant questions, and it's useful to use this as a case study. But extending that case study beyond morality obscures and leads to danger. And that's sort of my other takeaway from that history.
And I would add that these debates take place in a democracy. And the democracy is the right place for the debates to be held. And just because a version of this debate had an outcome in 1941, that doesn't mean it must have the same outcome today. So if you are an interventionist today, make your case, because in the end, you got to persuade the American people. Because what happens is, what happened in Afghanistan? America went into Afghanistan sort of unthinkingly, and eventually Americans got tired of it, and the United States pulled out of Afghanistan. So if you can make the case, anybody who says the United States ought to engage here, there is certainly welcome to do so. But let's have them make the case and not simply rely on old arguments that were made 80 years ago.
Excellent place to end. HW, thank you so much for joining me on The Realignment.
Great to talk to you.